Chapter 1. By 1985, El Salvador had become one of the most dangerous places in the world, a country small enough to cross in a day, yet so fractured that entire communities could vanish without a trace. Beneath the surface of daily life, the violence was not random. It was the product of decades of imbalance that had hardened into something far more dangerous than inequality, a system that left little room for change without force. For most of the 20th century, El Salvador was effectively controlled by a narrow elite often referred to as the 14 Families, a group of landowners who dominated the country's economy through vast coffee and cotton estates. Their wealth depended on a labor force that owned little or no land of its own, and over time, that imbalance shaped not just the economy, but the political system itself. Power remained concentrated, dissent was suppressed, and reforms, when they were attempted, rarely reached the people who needed them most. By the late 1970s, the strain had become unsustainable. Rural poverty deepened, political opposition grew more organized, and the government responded with increasing force. In October 1979, a reformist military junta overthrew President Carlos Humberto Romero, promising land reform and a more open political system. For a brief moment, it appeared that the country might step back from the edge. That moment did not last. Within months, right-wing factions within the military and their civilian allies began targeting anyone suspected of leftist sympathies. Trade unionists, teachers, priests, and students became targets. Death squads operated with growing confidence, and the reformers who had hoped to steer the country in a different direction found themselves sidelined or forced out entirely. The violence did not slow, it accelerated. In January 1980, the opposition consolidated into the Farabundo Martí National Liberation Front, or FMLN, a coalition of 5 guerrilla organizations with distinct leadership structures, but a shared goal: to overthrow the Salvadoran government and replace it with a socialist system. The movement drew strength from the rural poor, where resentment toward the existing order ran deepest, and it received support from abroad, including Cuba and other aligned governments. What had been political tension gave way to open war. The United States had long been involved in Central America, but the conflict in El Salvador took on new urgency in the context of the Cold War. After the Sandinista Revolution in Nicaragua in 1979, American policymakers viewed leftist movements in the region through the lens of Soviet influence, regardless of their local origins. When El Salvador's conflict escalated, Washington moved to support the government. Under the Ronald Reagan administration, that support expanded significantly. El Salvador became a test case for the broader strategy of containing leftist movements worldwide. By the mid-1980s, the United States was providing more than $1 million a day in military and economic assistance. American advisors trained Salvadoran units, helped shape counterinsurgency operations, and operated out of an embassy in San Salvador that had grown into one of the largest U.S. diplomatic missions in the world. Official limits capped the number of military personnel, but in practice, the American presence was substantial and deeply embedded. This was not a passive role. American support strengthened the Salvadoran military at a time when it was already engaged in a brutal campaign against insurgents and suspected sympathizers. Entire villages were treated as potential enemy territory. Operations designed to eliminate guerrilla influence often resulted in the deaths of civilians, whether through deliberate action or the indiscriminate nature of the fighting. The human cost of the war reflected that reality. By the time of the Zona Rosa attack in June 1985, the conflict had already claimed tens of thousands of lives. The United Nations Truth Commission would later document more than 22,000 cases of serious human rights violations, though the true number of deaths is widely believed to have reached between 75,000 and 80,000. Most of those killed were civilians. Responsibility for that violence was not confined to one side, but it was not evenly divided either. The Salvadoran military and the death squads tied to it carried out the great majority of the killing, massacres, assassinations, and systematic torture aimed at individuals and at whole communities suspected of sheltering the guerrillas. The most infamous case came in December 1981 in the hills of Morazan, where soldiers of the U.S.-trained Atlacatl Battalion moved through the village of El Mozote and the hamlets around it and killed close to 1,000 people across El Mozote and the hamlets around it. Most were women, children, and the elderly. 2 American reporters reached the village weeks later, walked through the ruins, and described the burned skulls and bones still in the rubble. One of them, Raymond Bonner of the New York Times, was handed a list of 733 names of the dead, roughly half of them children. The accounts ran on the front pages of the Times and the Washington Post. The next day, the Reagan administration certified to Congress that El Salvador was making progress on human rights. The reporting was disputed and the reporters discredited, and it would take a forensic exhumation a decade later to compel the official admission of what 2 journalists had already seen and counted in 1982. El Mozote was the worst of it, but it was not an exception. It was the pattern at its most extreme. The FMLN also contributed to the cycle of violence. Guerrilla forces planted mines along rural roads, carried out executions of local officials, and attacked economic infrastructure in ways that disrupted daily life for civilians across the country. Their strategy reflected a belief that weakening the state, even at the cost of civilian suffering, would ultimately shift the balance of power. What emerged from this environment was a war in which the distinction between combatant and civilian became increasingly blurred, and where symbols carried as much weight as military targets. Americans, by virtue of their government's role, were no longer just observers or advisors. They were part of the conflict in a way that made them visible and vulnerable. The attack that would come in Zona Rosa was not an isolated act of violence. It was the logical extension of a war that had already crossed every other line. In a conflict defined by escalation, targeting Americans in a crowded civilian setting was not a departure from the pattern. It was a continuation of it. On the night of June 19, 1985, that logic would arrive in the heart of San Salvador. Chapter 2. San Salvador. In 1985 was a city living 2 lives at once. During the day, traffic clogged the major avenues, as office workers hurried between appointments and street vendors competed for space along crowded sidewalks. At night, restaurants filled with conversation, movie theaters screened American films, and couples lingered over dinners that stretched well past sunset. To a visitor spending only a few days in the capital, it was possible to mistake the city for a place enjoying relative peace and prosperity. That impression rarely lasted. The Civil War was woven into daily life. Buildings damaged by bombings still stood unrepaired years after the attacks. Soldiers carrying automatic rifles guarded intersections throughout the city, often resting beside armored vehicles parked in plain view of passing traffic. Helicopters crossed the skyline after dark, and roadblocks could appear without warning. In some neighborhoods, electrical service disappeared for hours at a time because of sabotage, damaged infrastructure, or the simple realities of a country struggling to contain a growing insurgency. Most Salvadorans had learned to navigate these contradictions. They attended business meetings, went to school, celebrated birthdays, and planned weddings while a war unfolded around them. Life continued because there was little alternative. The contrast was especially visible in the western districts of San Salvador. Neighborhoods such as San Benito and Escalon had become home to diplomats, foreign business representatives, government officials, and many of the city's wealthiest families. Large homes sat behind high concrete walls topped with broken glass, razor wire, or electric fencing. Armed guards watched entrances from small security booths, a reminder that personal security had become an accepted part of urban life. In most countries, such precautions would have seemed extraordinary. In El Salvador, they had become routine. At the center of this world stood the Zona Rosa, a strip of restaurants, cafes, bars, and businesses clustered along the western edge of the city near the neighborhoods of San Benito and Escalon. By the mid-1980s, it had become the capital's most popular gathering place for anyone with money and a reason to be seen. Diplomats shared tables with businessmen and journalists. Foreign contractors mingled with embassy personnel. Conversations moved between Spanish and English as patrons drifted from one restaurant to another through the course of an evening. The district occupied an unusual place in the psychology of wartime San Salvador. People who gathered there were well aware their country was in the middle of a brutal conflict. Many had read about bombings and assassinations in the morning newspaper and passed military checkpoints on the way to dinner. Yet the Zona Rosa offered something increasingly rare, a sense that normal life had not entirely surrendered. Outdoor patios glowed beneath soft lighting. Tropical plants lined the walkways. Imported liquor stocked polished bars. Among Americans assigned to the U.S. Embassy, one of the most popular destinations was Chili's restaurant, its outdoor seating open to the street, tables close enough together that conversations from neighboring parties blurred into a single comfortable noise. Embassy personnel were not careless. Marine security guards received constant reminders about security and were expected to remain alert whenever they left the compound. They varied their routines when possible and paid attention to their surroundings. At the same time, they were not expected to spend every hour confined behind embassy walls. Maintaining some semblance of an ordinary life was considered part of enduring a difficult overseas assignment. On the evening of June 19, 1985, 6 Marines assigned to the American Embassy made their way into the Zona Rosa for dinner. They belonged to the Marine Security Guard program, one of the Corps' most selective assignments. Men chosen as much for composure and judgment as for physical ability. Their mission was to protect classified information and secure the embassy from internal threats. Unlike Marines serving in infantry units, they were not conducting combat operations in the countryside. Their work centered on diplomacy, vigilance, and the long discipline of standing watch in places where nothing appeared to be happening. Sergeant Thomas Handwork was respected for his professionalism and maturity. Corporal Gregory Weber possessed the quiet confidence that made younger Marines gravitate toward him. Corporal Patrick Kwiatkowski approached overseas duty with the enthusiasm of a young Marine experiencing the wider world for the first time. Sergeant Bobby Joe Dixon held high standards for himself and the Marines around him, believing discipline was inseparable from survival. Alongside them that evening were Corporal Jim Lane and Lance Corporal Anton Kossuth, both of whom had adapted to the particular demands of embassy duty in a country at war. For a few hours, none of them were standing post. They were simply friends going to dinner. Nearby sat people whose lives had little connection to the conflict. George Vini and Robert Alvarez of Wang Laboratories were unwinding after work. Engineers, lawyers, professors, and Salvadoran professionals filled the surrounding tables. Waiters moved between the outdoor patios carrying drinks and dinner plates, while traffic moved steadily along the boulevard outside. What none of them knew was that the district had been under observation for weeks. Members of the PRTC's Mardoqueo Cruz Urban Commando had studied the Zona Rosa with operational patience. They had mapped traffic patterns and identified the gathering places favored by foreigners, learning the rhythms of the district the way hunters learn the habits of game. The same streets that restaurant patrons saw as part of an enjoyable evening were being evaluated by others in terms of firing positions, access routes, and escape corridors. Within the FMLN leadership, there was growing conviction that the war needed to be brought back into the capital, violently and visibly. Fighting in the countryside no longer generated the same political pressure it once had. An attack in the Zona Rosa would strike at something different: the illusion that parts of San Salvador remained insulated from the war consuming the rest of the country. The plan was already in motion. 2 Toyota pickups had been prepared. The shooters had been assigned. The routes in and out of the district had been rehearsed. By the time dinner service began that evening, the people sitting beneath the patio lights had no reason to suspect that one of the most notorious attacks of the Salvadoran Civil War was less than hours away. Chapter 3. The men preparing the attack on the Zona Rosa believed they were striking at the heart of American influence in El Salvador. They belonged to the FMLN, the Farabundo Martí National Liberation Front, named after Agustín Farabundo Martí, the revolutionary executed after the 1932 peasant uprising that ended in La Matanza, the slaughter of tens of thousands of Salvadorans by the military government. To the guerrillas, Martí represented resistance, revolution, and unfinished history. But the FMLN was not one single organization. It was an alliance of competing factions, each with its own leaders, ideology, and methods. Among them, the PRTC stood apart. The Partido Revolucionario de los Trabajadores Centroamericanos was smaller than the other factions, but more aggressive in how it approached urban warfare. While much of the Civil War unfolded in jungles and mountain villages, the PRTC believed the capital itself needed to feel vulnerable again. Bombings, assassinations, kidnappings, and attacks inside San Salvador carried a different kind of power. Violence in the countryside frightened peasants. Violence in wealthy districts frightened governments. That strategy relied heavily on one unit, the Mardoqueo Cruz Urban Commando. The men inside it looked ordinary. Some worked jobs, some attended school. They blended into the city so naturally that most people passed them every day without noticing. Behind that appearance, however, existed a disciplined underground network built around surveillance, safe houses, weapons caches, and escape routes. Their operations were patient. Targets were studied carefully before anyone fired a shot. By 1985, the commando operated under a planner known as Mario, sometimes called Mario Gonzalez. His real identity remained unclear for years, but within the organization his reputation was simple. Mario planned attacks that worked. He selected routes, assigned shooters, secured weapons, and timed operations carefully enough that armed men could appear suddenly, strike fast, and disappear before security forces organized a response. The Zona Rosa operation carried exactly that kind of preparation. For weeks, operatives watched Avenida La Revolución and the surrounding restaurants. One of them, Ismael Dimas, reportedly conducted much of the surveillance himself. He observed where Americans gathered, how long Marines stayed in the area, and which restaurants they preferred. Patterns emerged quickly. The Marines liked Chili's. The outdoor seating left them exposed. The district itself offered perfect confusion for an attack. To the guerrillas, the Marines were not simply young Americans eating dinner. They represented the United States' role in the war, the advisors, the funding, the military support keeping the Salvadoran government alive. Killing them publicly inside the Zona Rosa would send a message far beyond San Salvador. By the evening of June 19th, the plan was already in motion. Weapons had been gathered through FMLN supply networks. M16 rifles were loaded. 2 Toyota pickup trucks had been prepared for the assault team. Routes into and out of the district had been rehearsed repeatedly. At some point before the attack, members of the commando reportedly gathered near Café Don Pedro close to the target area itself. Around them, the Zona Rosa moved through another normal evening. Music drifted from bars. Waiters carried drinks beneath patio lights. Foreign businessmen laughed over dinner while Marines relaxed after work only steps away. The guerrillas watched all of it quietly. By then, the attack was no longer a possibility. It was only waiting for the right moment. Chapter 4. By the summer of 1985, many residents of San Salvador had convinced themselves that the worst was behind them. The war still raged in the countryside, ambushes on rural roads, military operations in the mountains, the grinding violence of a conflict with no clear front lines. But inside the capital, something had shifted. Businesses stayed open later. Restaurants were full. Families ventured out after dark. The city had decided, or was trying to decide, that it had turned a corner. It was a comforting belief. It was also wrong. On the evening of Wednesday, June 19th, the 6 Marines assigned to the embassy gathered at the Marine House after finishing their shifts. The kitchen had prepared dinner. Someone lifted the lid off the serving tray. Liver and onions. Sergeant Bobby Joe Dixon stared at it and shook his head. "No chance," he said, laughing. "This is a third world country. We don't know whose liver that is." The room erupted. Greg Weber leaned back in his chair. "I'm not risking that." Someone suggested the Zona Rosa. No one argued. Less than an hour later, they were outside Chili's, settled at a table on the open terrace with drinks in front of them and the sounds of the district moving around them. Music from the neighboring restaurants, traffic on the boulevard, conversations from nearby tables bleeding together in the warm night air. The city felt safe. It felt like an evening with nowhere particular to be. Anton noticed a familiar face seated nearby. "Hey, Jim," he said. "That's Rob Hindle." Hindle worked in the embassy's tactical communications unit and was sitting with two women, including Sandra Castro from the visa section. "Tell the guys to order beers and nachos," Anton said. "We'll be right back." Hindle waved them over. "Sit down," he said with a grin. "I'll buy you a beer." The conversation drifted from embassy gossip to Marine Corps stories. Around them, the district remained alive with activity. Nearby, two American technicians from Wang Laboratories shared dinner with a Chilean engineer and several Salvadoran professionals celebrating a birthday. Waiters threaded through the crowd, balancing trays overhead, while music and laughter filled the night. No one paid much attention when two white Toyota Hilux pickup trucks pulled to the curb outside Chili's. At first, there was no reason to. Armed men in pickup trucks were a common sight in El Salvador. Soldiers conducted patrols and identification checks throughout the city, particularly among young men of military age. A pickup truck stopping outside a restaurant hardly seemed unusual. The vehicle idled for a moment. Then the doors opened. Several young men stepped out carrying M16 rifles. For a brief second, most people still assumed they were soldiers. Then one of the men turned toward the Marine's table and raised his weapon. "Viva la Revolución!" The words hung in the warm night air for a fraction of a second before the first burst of gunfire shattered the illusion of peace. Anton turned toward the sound, already thinking somebody had set off fireworks. The thought never had time to finish. Automatic rifle fire exploded across the terrace. The sound hit with a force he recognized immediately. Multiple rifles were firing in rapid succession, their sharp reports echoing between the restaurants and drowning out every other sound in the district. Marine training took over. He knew that sound, knew the rhythm of automatic fire. Before his mind had fully processed what was happening, his body was already moving. The first rounds tore into the Marine's table. For a moment, nobody seemed to understand what was happening. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Diners stared toward the street in confusion as glass shattered overhead and bottles exploded across tabletops. Then the screaming began. People dove beneath tables. Chairs toppled onto the pavement. Waiters dropped trays and ran for cover. Jim Lane disappeared from Anton's sight almost immediately. Sandra Castro collapsed beside him, frozen with fear. Anton grabbed her by the arm. "Listen to me," he shouted over the gunfire. "See that doorway? Crawl to it. Do not stand up. Crawl." She nodded frantically. Anton waited for a slight pause in the incoming fire and pointed toward Mediterranean restaurant only a few yards away. "Go!" Sandra and the other women began crawling across broken glass toward the entrance. Anton turned toward the civilians still trapped on the patio. "Move!" he yelled. "Everybody inside!" The command finally broke the paralysis. People scrambled toward cover as bullets ripped through hanging plants and shattered ceramic pots suspended above the terraces. Inside Mediterranean, the situation felt only marginally safer. The restaurant's large bay windows faced directly toward the street. Anyone firing from outside had a clear view into the dining area. As rounds cracked through the windows, dirt, pottery fragments, and fern leaves sprayed across the floor. Anton immediately saw the problem. One determined gunman could walk directly to those windows and kill everyone inside. "Is there a back room?" he asked Sandra. She pointed toward the rear of the restaurant. "Get everybody back there, away from the windows." Sandra began shouting instructions in Spanish while frightened patrons crawled toward the storage area behind the bar. Anton remained near the entrance. Outside, the attack continued. The gunmen moved methodically between Chile's, Flashback, and Mediterranean. Witnesses would later describe them firing in controlled bursts rather than blindly spraying the crowd. Several directed fire toward the walls surrounding the Brazilian ambassador's residence across the street. Others concentrated almost exclusively on the Marines. Anton spotted the bartender. "Do you have a weapon?" The man stared at him. "No." For a moment, Anton could hardly believe it. During his time in El Salvador, it often seemed as though everyone owned a firearm. "Fine," Anton said. "Where's the light switch?" The bartender pointed toward a dimmer mounted on a pole near the center of the room. Keeping low, Anton crawled through broken glass as rounds snapped through the windows above him. Reaching the switch, he jumped, slapped it downward, and dropped back to the floor. The restaurant vanished into darkness. Near the bar, another man crouched behind a counter holding a 9mm pistol. "I'm Lance Corporal Kossuth," Anton said, "Marine security guard." The man kept his eyes fixed on the entrance. "Don't get in front of me," he replied calmly. "If somebody comes through that door, I'm shooting." Outside, the gunfire rolled through the Zona Rosa in deafening waves. At one point, a civilian near Chile's drew a handgun and fired toward the attackers. The guerrillas immediately shifted their rifles toward him. The response was devastating. Moments later, additional shots rang out from somewhere above the restaurants, possibly from the roof area. One of the attackers suddenly spun and collapsed into the street. Whether he had been struck by return fire or accidentally shot by one of his own companions was never conclusively determined. The surviving gunman dragged him away while continuing to fire. Inside Mediterranean, Anton reached for his embassy radio. The channels were chaos. Local guards, embassy personnel, police, and emergency responders all seemed to be talking at once. Voices overlapped until the transmissions became nearly impossible to understand. Anton took control. "All local traffic moved to channels 1 and 2 immediately," he ordered. "Marine communications switched to channels 3 and 4. Clear the net." Gradually, the confusion eased. "This is MSG detachment," Anton transmitted. "We have 4 Marines down, multiple civilian casualties. Send ambulances immediately." Even as he said the words, they felt impossible. 4 Marines down. The phrase hung in the air. Outside, the gunfire finally began to diminish. In its place came something worse. The cries of the wounded. People called for help in both Spanish and English. Others shouted names. Some simply screamed. Anton looked toward the doorway. "I've got to check on my Marines." The man with the pistol shook his head. "Don't." "I have to." Keeping low, Anton moved toward the entrance and looked outside. The scene barely resembled the lively restaurant district that had existed only minutes earlier. Tables lay overturned across the sidewalk. Smoke drifted through the humid night air. Broken glass covered the pavement. Bodies were scattered among fallen chairs and shattered dishes. Then he saw Tom handwork. Tom lay face down near the terrace. Anton crawled to him, uncertain whether the attackers were truly gone. Tom still had a pulse, but the wounds were severe. The evidence suggested he had been shot from extremely close range. Nearby, Patrick Kwiatkowski managed to speak. "Help me!" Anton moved toward him. "Hang on, Pat. Help is coming." As he assessed the scene, the nature of the attack became increasingly clear. The gunman had not simply opened fire and fled. Evidence later indicated that after several Marines had fallen, at least one attacker moved closer and fired additional rounds into wounded victims at near point-blank range, while the other guerrillas maintained security around the perimeter. Greg Weber, despite suffering devastating wounds, attempted to crawl toward safety. Witnesses reported that the attacker followed him and fired again. Bobby Joe Dixon lay near the front of the restaurant suffering from multiple gunshot wounds. Anton could see immediately that the injuries were grave, though he could not yet know their full extent. Then, through the smoke and confusion, he spotted Jim Lane. Alive. For the first time since the attack began, Anton felt a small measure of relief. He grabbed his friend. "My God," he said. "I'm glad you're okay." The attack had lasted only minutes, though for those caught inside it, the passage of time felt distorted. When the surviving gunmen finally withdrew, they loaded their wounded companion into the pickup truck and disappeared into the city. Security personnel near the Brazilian ambassador's residence fired after them as they escaped into the darkness. When the shooting ended, 13 people lay dead or mortally wounded across the Zona Rosa. The wounded guerrilla would later die after being abandoned at a Red Cross facility. The Marines never made it to the hospital alive. For San Salvador, the illusion was over. The war had found the capital again. Chapter 5. The morning after the massacre, the Zona Rosa looked exhausted. Employees from the restaurant stood silently beneath the early sunlight, washing blood from the sidewalks with hoses while shattered glass scraped beneath their shoes. Black mourning ribbons hung from storefront entrances along the boulevard. The hanging plants outside Mediterranean drooped under bullet holes and broken pottery, while workers quietly turned overturned tables upright again, as if normal life might somehow return if they simply kept moving. Nothing about the district felt normal anymore. Inside the American embassy, the atmosphere felt heavier still. The Marines moved quietly through the compound while radios crackled in the background. Sleep came only in short stretches, if at all. Some remained awake for nearly 2 days, because every time they closed their eyes, they found themselves back on the terrace. The sudden burst of gunfire, the smoke hanging motionless in the warm night air, the screams, the bodies lying among overturned tables beneath the patio lights. The Marine house no longer resembled the place it had been only the day before. The music that usually drifted from someone's room had stopped. The televisions that carried ball games and the easy arguments about sports and future assignments, all of it had gone quiet. The building felt drained of something that could not easily be named and would not quickly return. The Marine Corps rotated embassy assignments regularly in part to reduce complacency and counterintelligence risks, but also because life at an overseas post could be psychologically demanding. Although embassy duty often appeared prestigious from the outside, much of the work consisted of repetitive security posts, long hours, and the constant awareness that political violence could erupt with little warning. Marines endured those pressures through the friendships they built with one another, which made the losses suffered in Zona Rosa feel deeply personal throughout the embassy community. The men killed in Zona Rosa had not simply been co-workers. Embassy duty forged relationships of a particular closeness because Marines assigned overseas had no one else. They stood watch together through long nights, trained together, traveled together, and spent nearly every waking hour in each other's company while serving in countries most Americans would never visit. The losses suffered on Boulevard del Hipódromo were not the abstract losses of men known by name and rank. They were the losses of friends whose habits and voices and particular ways of filling a room were known completely. Each of them had come from somewhere. Each had chosen this. Greg Weber grew up in Cincinnati, Ohio, the kind of city that produces athletes the way river towns produce them, quietly, without fanfare, through youth leagues and school gyms and the accumulated discipline of showing up. He graduated from Elder High School in 1981 as a member of the National Honor Society and president of the Fellowship of Christian Athletes, a combination that told you something essential about him. The physical confidence and the moral seriousness existed in the same body without contradiction. He ran cross-country. He worked extensively with the Big Brother program, spending time with underprivileged kids who needed someone older to show up consistently. He set a goal of finishing first in his Marine Security Guard class and accomplished it in February 1985, 4 months before he died. He felt he was needed most in El Salvador and had been stationed there since March. Anton Kossuth remembered standing beneath the pull-up bars during physical training behind the embassy compound in the humid Salvadoran heat. Weber had already completed 20 dead-hang pull-ups when Anton called out to him. "Come on, Weber, grab the top poles and do another one." Weber looked back over his shoulder with mock betrayal, as if Anton had just driven a knife between his shoulder blades. The Marines laughed. Then Weber reached above the pull-up bar itself, grabbing the top poles with both hands and forcing himself upward again. "This one's for you, Kossuth," the Marines shouted. Another pull-up. "This one's for my mom." The laughter grew louder. Then Weber grinned through the strain. "And this one's for the Marine Corps." When he finally dropped from the bar, the Marines around him erupted. Anton never forgot that moment, because it captured exactly who Greg Weber was: strong without arrogance, competitive without cruelty, confident without ego. A man who had tutored struggling kids in Cincinnati and then shipped himself to one of the most dangerous diplomatic posts in the hemisphere because he believed he was needed there. "That guy was just badass," Anton would later say quietly. "I loved Greg Weber." Thomas Handwerk grew up in Boardman, Ohio, a working-class suburb outside Youngstown, where his parents still lived. He graduated from Boardman High School in 1979. His parents later recalled that his only real trouble in school came when he skipped a class. Not to skip out, but to go to the library to read literature on the Marine Corps. The institution that would eventually define his life had found him long before he found it. He enlisted shortly after graduation and never looked back. He had served difficult assignments before El Salvador. Marines still joked about the Adak stare he brought back from his tour in Adak, Alaska, that distant look men acquired after too many months in isolated places surrounded by endless cold and darkness. Sometimes Tom would stare quietly at nothing in particular for long stretches, lost somewhere far away. But when work started, nobody in the detachment was more squared away. His locker looked inspection-ready at all hours. His uniforms were immaculate, boots polished, gear perfectly arranged. He had served with 1st Battalion, 4th Marines at 29 Palms, and then completed embassy duty in Hamburg, West Germany, before arriving in El Salvador in March. By then he understood that Marine security guard duty was not simply about carrying a rifle. Inside an embassy, a Marine represented the United States itself. Handwerk carried that understanding the way he carried everything else, naturally without making a production of it. He also carried quieter ambitions that the uniform didn't show. He was interested in fine arts. He had always wanted to write a screenplay, an Errol Flynn adventure, swashbuckling and grand, that he imagined the president might star in. He felt that Reagan had a special relationship with the men and women of the armed forces and had always wanted to meet him. He never got the chance. Instead, on a tarmac at Andrews Air Force Base 3 days after his death, Ronald Reagan came to him. He had been engaged to be married. Her name was Deborah Tratner. Patrick Kwiatkowski came from Wausau, Wisconsin, a paper mill city in the central part of the state where winters arrived early and stayed long and young men found ways to fill the time. He graduated from East High School in 1982, where he had been a dedicated altar boy at the local Catholic parish and an amateur boxer, a combination that surprised no one who knew him, since both required the same thing: showing up, absorbing punishment, and refusing to quit. He loved fishing. He loved snow skiing. He joined the Marines immediately after graduation because he wanted to be the best and because he intended to use the GI Bill to go to college when his tour was finished. He had attended MSG school at Quantico alongside Bobby Dixon as part of Class 3-83 and later served at the American Embassy in Nairobi before his assignment to El Salvador, arriving only 2 weeks before the attack. He was 20 years old. He talked constantly about his girlfriend, who was flying in the following day to teach English at the American school in San Salvador while they built a small life together during his posting. The Marines teased him about it without mercy. "Pat's settling down," somebody announced at the Marine House. "Shut up," Kwiatkowski laughed back. He would have turned 21 the day before the ceremony at Andrews, June 21, 1985. His sister Babette Ambrise, who attended that ceremony, was 9 months pregnant. She planned to name the baby Patrick if it was a boy. Bobby Joe Dixon was from Tuscaloosa, Alabama, and he carried the place with him the way Southerners often do, in his speech, in his standards, in the particular code of conduct that defined how he moved through the world. He graduated from Tuscaloosa High School in 1975 and enlisted in the Marine Corps in 1979. He had previously served as an embassy guard in Guatemala City before his assignment to El Salvador, which meant he had already spent time in one dangerous Central American posting and volunteered to return to another. He didn't have to go. He chose to. He was an athlete, a baseball pitcher with the kind of arm that earned him a reputation back home, and a devoted follower of University of Alabama football, which in Tuscaloosa was less a preference than a religion. His family remembered him as a man who almost always had a smile on his face, someone who genuinely enjoyed helping people who had less than he did. He pushed the younger Marines under his care hard, because he believed the standards of the Corps were not suggestions, and that discipline was the only thing standing between a Marine and a mistake that couldn't be undone. Anton Kossuth was the youngest in the detachment, and Dixon stayed on him constantly, about physical training, about weight, about the gap between where Anton was and where a Marine of his rank should be. He thought I was kind of a screw-up, Anton later joked. I felt like the youngest kid out of 9 brothers and sisters again. But he never hated him for it. He understood even then that Dixon was pushing him because standards mattered, and because in a country at war, the difference between sharp and sloppy could become the difference between alive and dead. Bobby Joe Dixon was 27 years old. His favorite song was Bruce Springsteen's Born in the USA, released the summer before Das, a song about a man coming home from a war his country had already moved past, wondering what he had given it and what it had given him back. Dixon never got to hear how it ended for the man in the song. He shipped to El Salvador before the album finished its run on the radio, and he never came home. The civilians who died that night carried their own unfinished lives into the Zona Rosa. George Vini and Robert Alvidrez had traveled to El Salvador for Wang Laboratories, part of the rapidly expanding computer industry that was reshaping global business during the 1980s. They were businessmen, not soldiers. Dr. Humberto Sáenz Ceballos had spent his life teaching students at Universidad Dr. José Matías Delgado, engineers, lawyers, and Salvadoran professionals, whose names never received the same international attention as the Marines, but whose families suffered the same loss, filled the surrounding tables that night. None of them expected the war to arrive at their table. And for the Marines who survived, the hardest part was not simply witnessing death. It was returning afterward to a Marine house filled with the specific, irreplaceable presence of men who had been alive only hours earlier. Weber grinning through impossible pull-ups, handwork standing squared away in every circumstance, Kwiatkowski laughing off the teasing about his girlfriend, Dixon riding the younger men because he loved the Corps and believed they could be better. Then suddenly they were gone, and the house that had been too loud was now too quiet, and the quiet was its own kind of violence, the kind that doesn't announce itself with gunfire, that simply settles in and refuses to leave. Chapter 6. Ronald Reagan understood something many politicians never quite grasp. Moments of national grief are not only felt, they are performed. Before the presidency, he had spent a lifetime in front of cameras, learning how tone, pause, and presence could shape how people experienced an event. At Andrews Air Force Base on June 22, 1985, that instinct mattered. The ceremony was not simply a memorial, it was a signal to grieving families, to the American public, and to adversaries watching closely from abroad. Reagan stepped to the podium with the bearing of a man who knew the country expected steadiness. He spoke first to the families, grounding his remarks in their loss rather than in policy. He named the Marines not as symbols, but as men, sons, husbands, fathers, whose absence would leave a permanent silence at kitchen tables and in quiet homes across the country. Only then did he widen the frame. The attack in Zona Rosa, he said, was not random violence. It was an act of terrorism designed to test American resolve, to force hesitation, to create doubt. The United States would not yield to that pressure. Those responsible would be pursued. Justice, however long it took, would come. These were not casual lines written for a speech. They were commitments delivered in public, at a moment when the cost of those words was visible in flag-draped coffins behind him. Reagan understood that once spoken in that setting, they could not easily be walked back. President Ronald Reagan and First Lady Nancy Reagan walk beside the flag-draped coffins of U.S. Marines during a solemn ceremony at Andrews Air Force Base. What he did not say outright, but what lingered beneath the surface, was that this was not the first time he had stood in such a moment. The memory of the 1983 Beirut barracks bombing still hung over his presidency. So did the long shadow of Vietnam War, a conflict that had reshaped how Americans viewed military commitments abroad. Even as he projected confidence, Reagan was acutely aware that public patience for overseas entanglements was not unlimited. That tension between resolve and restraint defined everything that followed. Congress and the machinery of response. In Washington, grief quickly hardened into political momentum. The Zona Rosa killings arrived at a moment when the administration's Central America policy was already under intense scrutiny. Debates over funding anti-communist forces in the region, particularly the Nicaraguan Contras, had divided Congress sharply. Skepticism about intervention was growing, especially among Democrats who questioned both the strategy and the moral cost. The murder of 4 U.S. Marines did not settle those debates, but it changed the emotional terrain on which they were fought. Abstract arguments about foreign policy suddenly carried the weight of fresh graves. Within weeks, the administration moved to act. Under the umbrella of what became known as the Act to Combat International Terrorism, the U.S. government announced a $100,000 reward for information leading to the conviction of those responsible for the attack. The offer was broadcast across El Salvador and throughout the region, a clear message that the case would not quietly fade. At the same time, the Federal Bureau of Investigation expanded its role. Its legal attaché office in San Salvador became a central node in the investigation, coordinating with Salvadoran authorities, sharing forensic capabilities, and attempting to impose structure on what was, in reality, a chaotic environment. On paper, these steps signaled seriousness. They suggested a government mobilizing its resources, translating outrage into action. In practice, the situation was far more complicated. The perpetrators were not part of a conventional criminal network. They belonged to the Farabundo Martí National Liberation Front, a decentralized insurgent force that operated through cells, aliases, and shifting lines of support. Its members did not leave tidy trails of evidence. They disappeared into rural strongholds, urban safe houses, and communities where loyalty was often shaped by fear as much as ideology. Traditional investigative tools, warrants, interviews, surveillance had limited reach in a country where large portions of territory were contested or effectively outside government control. The attack had been executed quickly, planned carefully, and followed by a clean withdrawal. By the time investigators began piecing together what had happened, the men responsible were already gone. El Salvador. War within the investigation. In San Salvador, the reaction unfolded under very different pressures. José Napoleón Duarte faced a balancing act that few leaders could navigate cleanly. His government depended heavily on American support, financial, military, and political, and the killing of U.S. personnel placed that relationship under immediate strain. He needed to show Washington that El Salvador could deliver results. At the same time, he had to manage a military establishment that operated with its own priorities, its own chains of influence, and, at times, its own disregard for civilian oversight. The investigation moved forward with American assistance. FBI forensic support was introduced. Intelligence sharing increased. Efforts were made to track suspects through a mix of captured guerrillas, informants, and fragmentary intelligence reports. Yet the process was constrained from the beginning. El Salvador's judicial system in 1985 did not function with the independence or reliability that American officials might have preferred. Cases involving guerrilla activity often fell under military jurisdiction, where proceedings were shaped as much by political considerations as by legal standards. Evidence could be compromised. Testimony could be coerced. Outcomes were rarely predictable. And beyond the courtroom, the war itself distorted everything. Witnesses were reluctant to speak. Informants risked death. Entire communities were caught between government forces and insurgents, each side demanding loyalty and punishing perceived betrayal. In that environment, truth was not just difficult to establish, it was dangerous. The result was an investigation that, despite initial momentum, struggled to gain traction. Leads surfaced and vanished. Suspects were identified, then disappeared into the fog of a conflict that had no clear front lines. What began as a moment of unified outrage in Washington at Andrews, in headlines across the United States, was now colliding with the reality of a war that did not yield easily to justice. Chapter 7. The bodies had not yet been flown home when the Pentagon began planning the response. In the hours after the attack on Boulevard del Hipódromo, as embassy personnel worked to account for the dead and Salvadoran investigators processed the crime scene under generator lights, a different set of conversations was already underway in Washington. The public face of the American response was grief and outrage, and the promise of justice. The private face, taking shape in classified compartments at the Pentagon and the National Security Council, was something the public would never be told about. It had a name. Operation 9 Iron. The plan was specific. American gunships already operating in the region, deployed out of Panama, their crews experienced from months of nightly surveillance flights over El Salvador, would carry out clandestine surgical strikes against guerrilla base camps inside the country. The Defense Intelligence Agency had identified the targets. 3 camps suspected of direct association with the groups responsible for the Zona Rosa attack. The mission called for precision, speed. No public announcement, no congressional notification. A clean, quiet, overwhelming response that would make clear to the FMLN, to every guerrilla organization operating in Central America, to anyone watching, that killing American Marines at a restaurant table carried consequences that no alias and no safe house could protect against. Less than a week after 4 men were murdered on a sidewalk, the plan was ready. The gunships chosen were AC-130 Spectre gunships, among the most lethal aircraft in the American arsenal, capable of sustained, precise fire from altitudes that left targets with no warning and no time to run. Their crews had been flying over El Salvador for months, mapping the terrain, tracing the movement of guerrilla units through the mountains and the capital's outskirts. They knew the country the way a hunter knows ground he has covered in the dark. They knew where the camps were. They knew the routes in and out. They had, in the language of the mission briefing, precise targets to be engaged. On June 29th, Defense Secretary Caspar Weinberger was briefed in full. He listened to the operational details with the attentiveness of a man who understood that what he was hearing had not yet been shared with Congress, and would not be. When the briefing concluded, he asked a single question. What were the chances of success? The briefer paused, very low. Weinberger said nothing for a moment. Then he raised his concern about civilian casualties, about the certainty that guerrilla camps embedded in the Salvadoran countryside were never entirely separate from the villages around them, and that surgical, in the vocabulary of air warfare, was always a relative term. The assessment was honest, and it was bleak. Low probability of eliminating the specific men responsible, high probability of killing people who had nothing to do with the Zona Rosa, and the absolute certainty that any visible American military action inside El Salvador would detonate a political crisis in Congress that the administration was not prepared to survive. The meeting ended without a final decision, but the aircraft were already being prepared. Reagan had sent a personal emissary to Duarte, not a cable, not a formal diplomatic note, but a face-to-face conversation, the kind that left no paper trail. The message was simple. The United States needed Duarte's authorization to act. His government depended on American support in ways that did not appear in any public accounting. The weapons, the training, the intelligence. The quiet presence of advisors operating in the field under congressional limits nobody was enforcing too carefully. Washington was prepared to move. It needed Duarte to open the door. The emissary delivered the message. Duarte listened. And then the aircraft went up. For 2 consecutive nights, American gunships flew over El Salvador in the dark. Below them, invisible in the mountain terrain, were the camps the Defense Intelligence Agency had spent weeks mapping. The crews flew the routes they had rehearsed. They acquired the targets. They held their positions at altitude, their weapons systems active, the camps sitting in their sights with a stillness that had no idea it was being watched from above. The pilots and crew chiefs and gunners sat in the noise and vibration of the aircraft and waited for the order that would change the nature of the American involvement in El Salvador permanently and irrevocably. On the ground in San Salvador, the guerrillas who had planned the Zona Rosa attack were sleeping, or they were moving, or they were doing what clandestine fighters do in the days after a successful operation, laying low, changing locations, waiting for the immediate pressure to pass. They did not know that American gunships were circling in the darkness above the country. They did not know that men with their fingers near triggers were looking at targets connected to everything they had built. They did not know how close it came. The first night passed. The gunships returned to Panama without firing. The second night, the aircraft went up again. The same routes, the same targets acquired, the same waiting. Whatever conversation had taken place between Reagan's emissary and President Duarte, whatever had passed between them in that room without a paper trail, its answer was now visible in the silence coming down from Washington. No order. No authorization. The threshold that would have turned 9 iron into something that couldn't be taken back held for a second night. The aircraft came home. The camps below remained untouched. The guerrillas went on sleeping, or moving, or waiting for the pressure to pass, never knowing that on 2 consecutive nights the United States had been an order away from a different kind of war entirely. The operation was stood down, quietly, without announcement, without any public record that it had ever existed. José Napoleón Duarte had told Reagan's emissary what he could not say publicly and could not put in writing. He could not authorize direct American military action on Salvadoran soil. His government would do everything in its power to strike the groups responsible. But the strikes would be Salvadoran strikes. He was not opening that door. The gunships had flown for 2 nights and come home empty. Whatever was going to happen next, whatever justice meant in a country where the war was still being fought and the men who planned the killing were already underground, and the institutions built to find them were pulling in 17 directions at once. It was not going to look like Operation 9 Iron. It was going to be slower than that, quieter, and considerably harder to see. Chapter 8. The police arrived late. Some arrived by bus. That detail sounds absurd until you remember what El Salvador was in 1985. A country fighting a civil war with too few men, too few vehicles, and too many emergencies. While the wounded were still crying out and the smell of burned gunpowder drifted across the Zona Rosa, investigators from the National Police's technical section were climbing off public transportation because there were no patrol cars available. By the time they reached Chili's, the 4 Marines had already been rushed to the hospital. 8 bodies still lay where they had fallen. Around them stood a crowd. Crowds ruin crime scenes. The people who had hidden behind walls and under tables slowly returned. Some moved vehicles so traffic could pass. Others wandered through the debris in disbelief. A few bent down and picked up shell casings, still warm in some cases, and slipped them into their pockets as grim souvenirs. Overnight, shopkeepers patched bullet holes in their storefronts. The pavement was washed. Blood disappeared into the drains. Later, investigators would describe the scene in bureaucratic language that barely concealed their frustration. Evidence had been moved, disturbed, or removed altogether. They could not determine exactly how many weapons had been used. They could not say with certainty where all the shooters had stood or even how many there had been. The massacre was less than a day old, and already parts of it had become unknowable. The laboratory offered only fragments. A handful of 5.56mm shell casings suggested at least 4 rifles. 9mm rounds pointed to 2 additional weapons. Investigators suspected one of the guns had been used in an earlier guerrilla attack on a Salvadoran prison, but the police laboratory lacked the microscope necessary to compare the microscopic markings left behind by the weapon's firing pin and barrel. The lead died not because it was disproven, but because no one had the equipment to prove it. Then there was the bullet recovered from the wounded guerrilla who had been abandoned at the Red Cross. It simply disappeared. Somewhere between the operating room, the evidence locker, and the paperwork, it vanished. Nobody could later explain where it had gone. Chapter 9. They came for the shop on August 12th. Tapiceria Estrella was an ordinary upholstery business tucked among dozens of modest storefronts in San Salvador. Inside were half-finished chairs, bolts of fabric leaning against the walls, and the familiar smells of glue, sawdust, and old furniture. Customers could pass the place every day without remembering it, which was precisely what made it useful. According to investigators, the shop had served as more than a business. It had been a front, a meeting point, a quiet corner of the guerrilla underground hidden in plain sight. The National Guard did not come looking for furniture. They came looking for Ulysses. Nearly 8 weeks had passed since the Zona Rosa massacre. The 4 Marines had already been returned to the United States and buried. Their families were left with grief, while Washington was left with anger, embarrassment, and questions. President José Napoleón Duarte needed to show that his government could find the killers. American officials needed proof that El Salvador's security forces could deliver justice in a case the entire world was watching. The raid seemed to offer the first real break. When National Guardsmen burst through the front entrance, they expected to arrest one of the men believed to be responsible for the massacre. Instead, they arrested everyone except the man they had come for. José Roberto Rivas was taken into custody. So was another employee, David Wilbur Villalta Ruano. But Ulysses, the man investigators most wanted, slipped through the rear exit before anyone realized he was inside. The arrest team had failed to cover the back of the building, a simple mistake with enormous consequences. By the time the guardsmen understood what had happened, Ulysses had vanished into the city. San Salvador had a way of swallowing men, especially men who knew how to disappear. Rivas gave them another lead, a garage on the western side of the capital where Ulysses could sometimes be found. An arrest team moved quickly, hoping to recover from the mistake at the shop. But once again, they arrived too late. Ulysses was gone. In his place, they found his brother, José Abraham Dimas Aguilar, who was arrested instead. Another suspected associate, a man called Macias, slipped away a step ahead of the team. The investigators returned with more prisoners, but not the man they most wanted. It was becoming a pattern. Raids led to empty rooms. Safe houses had been abandoned. Leads unraveled into rumors. The guerrillas moved through shops, garages, apartments, and side streets with a discipline that suggested either an exceptional underground network or advance warning. Either possibility was troubling. What the authorities had so far was a furniture maker, another worker, and a guerrilla's brother. The gunmen remained free. In Washington, there had never been much appetite for patience. In the first days after the massacre, senior officials did not speak primarily in the language of indictments and courtrooms. They spoke in the language of war. At a meeting convened at President Reagan's request, representatives from the CIA, State Department, Pentagon, and Justice Department considered the American response. The question was not simply how to prosecute the killers. It was how to find them, how to dismantle the organization that had sent them, and whether capturing them mattered more than destroying the network around them. A joint task force centered around the CIA station in San Salvador began coordinating the hunt. Informants were recruited. Suspected safe houses were watched. Military units raided locations across the capital. Investigators chased whispers through neighborhoods where silence could mean loyalty, fear, or survival. But even if the killers were caught, another question remained unresolved. Where would they be tried? American lawyers concluded that the United States had a legal path. The murdered Marines could be classified as internationally protected persons, meaning their killers could be prosecuted in an American court even though the attack had taken place abroad. A conviction could carry life imprisonment. Yet Washington hesitated. The evidence was in El Salvador. The witnesses were in El Salvador, and for years the United States had pressured the Salvadoran government to strengthen its courts, reform its security forces, and prove that justice could survive during civil war. To seize this case, simply because the victims were Americans, would expose a contradiction too obvious to ignore. So the case stayed in El Salvador, inside a system the United States had helped build, defended publicly, and distrusted privately. That was the system into which José Roberto Rivas disappeared on August 12, 1985. The country remained under a state of siege. Under those rules, cases involving guerrillas went to the military, and suspects could be held incommunicado for 15 days while the army investigated them. Ordinary safeguards gave way to military necessity. 45 minutes after Rivas arrived at National Guard headquarters, the questioning began. The men interrogating him belonged to G2, Salvadoran Military Intelligence. They were not detectives in the American sense. Their job was not to preserve evidence for a courtroom. Their job was to extract information. Years later, a Justice Department lawyer studying the file would write carefully that they were not trained in law enforcement techniques as Americans understood them. There was no advice of rights at the start. The first session lasted about 3 hours. Questioning resumed later and continued until 2 in the morning. Over the next 4 days, the interrogations averaged close to 14 hours a day. Rivas was allowed to eat and use the bathroom, but he was probably deprived of sleep. Representatives of the Red Cross were permitted to see him at some point during the 15-day period, as Salvadoran law required, but they did not interview him. For 4 days, Rivas gave them pieces of his life. He admitted his years with the movement. He named operations. He described Tapicheria Estrella as a front, but he would not admit Zona Rosa. Then, on the 5th day, interrogators put another name in front of him, Garcia. They told Rivas that Garcia had been arrested and that Garcia had talked. Something in Rivas began to give way. After a long interrogation on August 17th, he stopped denying it. He confessed that he had fired on the Marines. 3 days later, on August 20th, the confession was made formal. This time, the proceeding wore the clothing of due process. A secretary recorded the statement. 2 guard officers who had not participated in the interrogation were present. Rivas was told he was presumed innocent, that he could not be compelled to incriminate himself, and that he would be owed compensation if the charges proved false. But because this was a military investigation, he was not provided a lawyer. Then he laid out the operation in remarkable detail. Days before the attack, Ulysses had told him they were going to knock over some Americans. On June 19th, the order was confirmed. Rivas, Ulysses, and Macias were to meet at the brothers' garage that afternoon. From there, they went to Café Don Pedro. At 10 minutes before 9, a yellow Toyota pickup arrived carrying Ulysses, Macias, Julio, men called Pepe and Walter, and 2 others Rivas did not know. Ulysses handed Rivas an M16, a green knapsack heavy with ammunition, a cap, and a camouflage shirt. He was part of the strike team. When they reached the place, he was to fire. At the monument to the savior of the world, a light blue car met them and honked twice. The pickup honked back. Then both vehicles drove into the Zona Rosa. In front of Chili's, Ulysses stepped out and opened fire on a table. Julio fired too, then pointed Rivas toward the Americans and shouted, "There, buddy." Rivas raised his rifle and fired into the table. As he shot, Julio crossed into his line of fire, and one of Rivas's rounds struck him in the back. Off to the side, Walter and another man fired toward the security men at the Brazilian embassy, keeping them pinned while the attack unfolded. When Ulysses believed the foreigners were dead, he shouted for retreat. The gunmen ran for the truck. Only then did Ulysses ask where Julio was. He turned back, found the wounded guerrilla lying in the gutter, lifted him into the bed of the pickup, and fled into the city. Somewhere down the road, they let Rivas out. He left the rifle and clothing in the truck and walked home. The next morning, he went back to the shop because a man who failed to appear would draw attention. Ulysses came in and asked why he had shot Julio. Afraid of him, Rivas denied it. He said he did not know who had fired the round. The confession was extraordinary in its detail, and that detail became both its strength and its problem. A statement so vivid could be the truth spoken by a participant, or it could be the product of days of interrogation in a military system built to make men talk. Investigators needed to know which it was. On August 23rd, they took Rivas back to Zona Rosa. The terrace no longer looked as it had on the night of the massacre. The bodies were gone. The blood had been washed away. The restaurants had reopened. Bullet holes had been repaired or covered. Life had resumed in that strange way it does after public violence, when a place tries to look ordinary again, even though everyone knows what happened there. But Rivas did not move through the scene like a stranger. He knew where the gunmen had stood. He knew where the victims had fallen. He understood the direction of fire and the movement of the attackers. He could reconstruct the attack with an intimacy that would have been difficult to fake. An FBI report later noted that he displayed detailed knowledge of the crime scene and the manner of the killings. The reenactment changed the weight of his confession. Rivas had been there. That much was becoming hard to dispute. Then, investigators brought Garcia to the same terrace. Garcia had also confessed, but the moment he was asked to walk through the attack, his story began to collapse. He could not show where the gunmen had been positioned. He could not explain the sequence of events. He did not appear to know the scene in any meaningful way. Standing on the sidewalk where he supposedly had participated in the massacre, Garcia seemed less like a man revisiting a crime than a man seeing the place for the first time. Questioned again, he recanted. He said he had confessed because he was afraid of the police. The contrast was devastating. Rivas knew too much to be dismissed. Garcia knew too little to be believed. One confession appeared to gain strength at the crime scene. The other disintegrated there. Yet both had come from the same system. That was the problem the Americans could not easily explain away. If Rivas's confession was true and Garcia's confession was false, then truth and coercion had been produced side by side, in the same rooms, by the same methods, under the same state of siege. The system had delivered an answer, but it had also delivered doubt. The day after the reenactments, the CIA station polygraphed Rivas. The results deepened the ambiguity. He was judged truthful about his own role in the killings, but not truthful when he insisted Garcia had played no role. The needle moved again when he denied seeding his confession with false names, and again when he denied holding back information. The polygrapher noted his indifferent attitude, as though Rivas had already accepted whatever fate was coming. A military judge reviewed the file, heard the interrogators swear that the confession had been freely given, found probable cause, and moved the case toward trial. Then came the cameras. On August 30th, President Duarte arranged a press conference. Rivas stood before the public and admitted that he had been one of the shooters in Zona Rosa. Dimas and Garcia stood beside him and acknowledged membership in the organization and supporting roles in the attack, while denying they had pulled any trigger. For Duarte's government, the value of the moment was obvious. Suspects had been arrested. Confessions had been obtained. The massacre had not vanished into the war like so many other killings. The government could point to men in custody and say that the case was moving. But whether the cameras had captured justice, theater, or some uneasy fusion of the two was harder to say. The Americans watching were not naive. For years they had documented the Salvadoran security forces' reliance on confessions produced under pressure. They knew how the system worked. They had argued over it, condemned it in private, and accepted it in practice because the alliance required certain things to be known but not always said aloud. A confession wrung from a sleepless man after days of questioning, without a lawyer, by officers trained to break information loose rather than build a court case, could still be true. Rivas's confession almost certainly contained truth. The reenactment suggested that much. But the same process had also produced Garcia's confession, and Garcia's confession appeared false. That was the quiet irony at the heart of the case. The United States had insisted the prosecution remain in El Salvador because that was where the crime occurred, where the evidence was, and where Washington claimed justice needed to function. Yet the confession that gave the case its force might never have survived the standards of an American courtroom. So the investigation reached its first great resolution in a cloud of uncertainty. Garcia sat in a Salvadoran cell, charged with subversive association, a man whose confession had helped unlock the case, but whose reenactment suggested he had never stood on that terrace as a participant. Rivas had provided the operation in cinematic detail. Ulysses escaping through the back door, Macias staying a step ahead, Julio falling into his own comrade's line of fire, and above them all a man called Mario, the unseen commander who had not been caught and would not appear before the cameras. The investigators finally had what they had lacked for weeks: names, confessions, a map of the operation, and a shooter who could walk them through the crime scene. What they had less of, the longer they studied how those answers had been obtained, was certainty. And somewhere in San Salvador, the men who had planned the massacre watched the coverage, counted the names that had not been spoken, and calculated how much time they had left. Chapter 10. Letter to President Duarte. August 29, 1985. Dear Mr. President, I was gratified to hear from you of the important accomplishments of your government's ongoing investigation of the murder of 13 persons, including American and Salvadoran citizens, in a brutal raid in San Salvador on June 19, 1985. I congratulate you on the speed and professionalism of the arrest of William Celio Rivas Bolanos, Juan Miguel Garcia Melendez, and José Abraham Dimas Aguilar. On behalf of the victims' families and the United States, I personally thank all involved. Terrorism is the antithesis of democracy. By brutal acts against innocent persons, terrorists seek to exaggerate their strength and undermine confidence in responsible government, publicize their cause, intimidate the populace, and pressure national leaders to accede to demands conceived in violence. Where democracy seeks to consult the common man on the governance of his nation, terrorism makes war on the common man, repudiating in bloody terms the concept of government by the people. I am proud that the Special Investigative Unit, which we in the U.S. worked with you to develop, is playing an active role in the investigation. I shortly will be consulting with Congress to find new ways to assist Central American nations in their laudable efforts to overcome the scourge of terrorism. I hope that, with the support of the Congress, we can help police and military units to respond consistently with the maturity, professionalism, and respect for the law shown by your police in this case. We must not compromise with criminals. Appeasement only invites renewed attack. Terrorists merit only swift, certain justice under the rule of law. The people of El Salvador and the people of the United States stand together against terrorism. Each defeat for the terrorist makes the world safer and more just for everyone. Sincerely, Ronald Reagan. Chapter 11. He didn't run, and that was the first thing that surprised them. 4 years of chasing a ghost, and when Salvadoran police finally had Pedro Antonio Andrade in a chair, he didn't rage or deny or demand a lawyer. He looked at the men across the table with the steady eyes of someone who had spent a long time thinking about this moment, who had, in some sense, been preparing for it, since the night he watched a white Toyota pickup disappear into the streets of San Salvador with a wounded man in the bed and 4 American Marines dying on the pavement behind it. He looked at them the way a man looks at something he has already decided how to handle, and he told them who he was. Pedro Antonio Andrade. alias Mario Gonzalez, head of the Mardoqueo Cruz Urban Commando. Then he folded his hands on the table and waited for them to make the next move. Inside the PRTC, the name Mario had carried genuine weight, not the hollow authority of a title conferred by rank, but the real currency of a man who had planned operations that worked, who had built networks that held under pressure, who had looked at a strip of restaurants along Boulevard del Hipódromo and seen something his commanders had not fully articulated, not simply a place where Americans gathered, but a place where Americans gathered without expecting to die. The psychological geography of the Zona Rosa was the insight. The attack was the execution. He had turned that observation into an operation precise enough to kill 4 Marines, wound 9 others, and generate headlines on 2 continents. And then he had walked away from it and dissolved into an alias so completely that for 4 years the most sophisticated intelligence apparatus in the Western Hemisphere had been hunting a name without a face, a voice without a body, a commander known to his own fighters primarily as a presence that planned things and then disappeared. He had been arrested on charges unrelated to the Zona Rosa entirely, which was either the cruelest irony the case had yet produced or simply the way clandestine careers tend to end, not in the moment of maximum exposure, but in some quieter sideways collision with the ordinary machinery of law enforcement that no amount of operational discipline can indefinitely avoid. The CIA station in San Salvador moved within hours of learning who was in custody. By May 31st, 72 hours after his arrest, the station had already run the loop to Langley and back, pulling everything they had on Andrade and building an assessment that moved up the chain with unusual speed. Their findings were unambiguous. In those 3 days alone, Andrade had already led Salvadoran authorities to the largest single cache of guerrilla weapons recovered during the entire insurgency. Not a cache. The cache. Everything the PRTC had buried, stockpiled, and pre-positioned across the capital over years of patient preparation surfaced in 72 hours because Andrade had decided, with the same operational precision he had applied to everything else in his career, that it was time to be cooperative. He hadn't been broken. He hadn't been threatened into it. He had made a calculation about what cooperation was worth to him and acted on it, which told the CIA station everything they needed to know about who they were actually dealing with. He wasn't a field operative carrying narrow knowledge of a single attack. He was a senior architect of the PRTC's urban apparatus, a man who understood how the cells were organized, where the remaining arms were hidden, how orders moved through the network without leaving traces, who reported to whom and what the next operation looked like before it had acquired a name. He carried inside him the internal mechanics of a clandestine structure that American and Salvadoran intelligence had spent years and enormous resources trying to penetrate from the outside and had never fully mapped, and he was now sitting in a room in San Salvador under arrest, apparently willing to talk, the kind of source that appears once in a generation, if at all, and only under circumstances this specific and this unlikely. The Department of Justice arrived at an entirely different conclusion. To the prosecutors who had been building the Zona Rosa case since the summer of 1985, who had sat through the early confessions in the hot rooms of the Salvadoran investigative apparatus, through the amnesty ruling and Duarte's intervention, through 4 years of grinding procedural delay in courts that moved with the unhurried patience of institutions under no particular pressure to produce results, Andrade was not a windfall and not an asset. He was the man who had planned the murder of 4 United States Marines, who had stood at the operational center of the worst terrorist attack on American diplomatic personnel in Central American history, and who had subsequently spent 4 years living under an alias while the investigation ground itself down trying to find him. In early June, a Justice Department attorney flew to San Salvador. The interview was arranged through the embassy's legal officer, with Salvadoran authorities present, and the CIA station received explicit instructions from headquarters that carried the weight of a decision already made at levels above the room. Stay entirely out of the evidence-gathering process. Do not insert yourself into the prosecutorial lane. Let the DOJ team work. Andrade sat across from them and gave them almost nothing, and he did it with a composure that the prosecutors in the room would later struggle to adequately describe. He acknowledged that he had played a role in the Zona Rosa operation, delivered the phrase with the careful, almost surgical neutrality of a man who understood exactly how much prosecutorial weight each word carried, precise enough to suggest candor, elastic enough to mean anything a competent defense attorney might later need it to mean. When FBI personnel conducted follow-up interviews, he retreated further into the same controlled territory, offering information about FMLN operations with obvious intelligence value, feeding one part of the American appetite in the room while carefully starving the other. He was giving enough to remain valuable, not enough to place himself in a courtroom. He had spent years teaching others how to survive exactly this kind of interrogation, how to read the men across the table, how to identify what each of them needed and offer just enough of it to stay useful without crossing the line that would make him expendable, and he was demonstrably better at it than anyone the American government had sent to question him. Salvadoran investigators strapped him to a polygraph in July 1989. Then a second time when the first result came back inconclusive. The analysts noted, with the careful professional hedging of people who understood exactly what the notation meant for the case, a tentative indication that his denials might have been truthful. The second examination settled into the same uncertain territory. A CIA polygrapher reviewed both sets of results and added a notation that would quietly devastate whatever prosecutorial momentum remained. Andrade had been recovering from a cold during the first examination, and under standard professional protocols, the test should have been postponed before it was administered. The results were therefore compromised in ways that made them unreliable in either direction, neither a confirmation of guilt nor a clean exoneration, simply a document that a defense attorney could use to introduce reasonable doubt into a case that was already struggling to establish proof beyond it. 4 years of investigation, 2 governments, the full weight of American prosecutorial intent brought to bear on a single man in a single room, and a cold had muddied the only forensic tool they had left. The prosecutors had flown to San Salvador expecting a confession or a break decisive enough to finally move the case into a federal courtroom. They were leaving with something considerably harder to work with than a denial. They were leaving with ambiguity, with the legal vertigo of near certainty about a man who had nonetheless managed to position himself just outside the edge of provable guilt. Andrade understood this with a clarity that was visible to everyone in the room, even when he said nothing, which was often. He had understood it, most likely, before they landed. What had developed in that room in San Salvador was a standoff that neither side could resolve without cost. The CIA wanted his knowledge of the PRTC's urban network, its arms pipelines, its command architecture, its surviving personnel, the future operations he might know about or could help prevent. The Justice Department wanted him in a federal courtroom, under oath, answering for 4 dead Marines and the families who had buried them. Neither could fully have him without destroying what the other needed, and Andrade, who had built his entire career on the study of what institutions wanted and the precise calibration of how much to give them, was watching both sides of the American government pull against each other with the patience of a man who had been preparing for this negotiation since long before anyone in that room knew his real name. He had constructed a clandestine network inside a capital city and run it for years without detection. He had planned and executed one of the most notorious attacks of the Salvadoran Civil War, and then vanished so thoroughly that his alias had become a kind of legend among the people hunting him. He had done all of this while remaining, to the outside world, invisible. The men across the table were skilled and experienced and almost entirely certain of his guilt, and they were working with the full institutional resources of the United States government behind them. Whatever came next, none of them were going to outmaneuver him easily, and somewhere behind those steady eyes, Pedro Antonio Andrade already knew it. Chapter 15. They called it justice. They said so in press conferences and encrypted cables and internal memos, often enough and seriously enough that the word began to acquire the weight of policy. It wasn't policy. Garcia Melendez had slipped across a border he had no business crossing and handed investigators the break they needed, and been deported and charged for it. The reward money may never have found him. The men he identified were in cells, But the man who had planned everything was negotiating his intelligence value from a chair in San Salvador. Each of these outcomes had its own explanation. Taken one at a time, each could be rationalized. Laid together, they formed a pattern. His name was Andrade. He was not the only one, but he was the clearest case. The place where the logic of what was actually happening became impossible to look away from, for anyone willing to look. Andrade had intelligence value. The phrase appeared in the internal deliberations, the interagency cables, the careful negotiations between the prosecutors who wanted to charge him and the intelligence officers who wanted to keep him. It was a bloodless term for a specific and very human calculation. This man knows things we need to know more than we need him in a courtroom. The prosecutors kept pressing. They pressed for months and then for years, through delays and obstructions that accumulated with the patient inevitability of sediment, each one individually explicable, together devastating. The Justice Department lawyers who worked the case were not indifferent. The FBI investigators were not unmoved. The people making the arguments for accountability were making them seriously, and they knew they were losing, and they kept making them anyway. It didn't matter. Every time criminal accountability collided with intelligence value won. Every single time, without exception, across years, the outcome so consistent it stopped resembling a series of decisions and started resembling gravity. In the Salvadoran military courts, the case moved with a slowness all its own, not the slowness of incompetence, but of a system applying exactly as much friction as was needed to produce exactly the delay that was required. Rivas and Dimas sat in custody through the late 1980s, while the proceedings ground forward slowly enough that the world would lose interest long before a verdict ever came. In 1987, the Salvadoran military court dismissed the charges entirely. President Duarte overturned the ruling under American pressure, but the legal haze that settled over the case never fully lifted. American prosecutors explored bringing it into U.S. courts, a path that ran immediately into its own landscape of obstacles: jurisdiction, evidence, diplomacy. The sheer political complexity of trying foreign nationals in an American courtroom for murders committed in the middle of another country's war. Each obstacle was real. Together they formed something that functioned less like a legal problem than like terrain, the kind you can see clearly across and never quite cross. José Antonio Bolaños Rivas, alias Macias, one of the four gunmen, was never captured at all. He left behind a name, a role, and a silence that stretched forward through decades without ever breaking. Still out there somewhere or dead. The record does not know which. That was the thing that emerged when you laid it all out. Not a single act of betrayal, not one villain making one cold decision in one dark room, but a pattern, consistent and almost mechanical in how it operated. Intelligence services, prosecutors, diplomats, foreign partners, all of them pursuing different missions, all of them resolving the conflicts between those missions in the same direction, year after year. The institutions were not evil. That was the unsettling part. The CIA officers who argued for protecting assets like Andrade were not unmoved by 4 dead Marines. The prosecutors who watched the case dissolve were not cynics. The officials who made the trade-offs believed, most of them, that they were making necessary ones. That in a clandestine war against a disciplined Marxist guerrilla movement that had just murdered American servicemen at a restaurant table, the cold arithmetic of intelligence sometimes had to outweigh the warmer demands of justice. They were wrong. Or they were right. And that is worse. A decade later, Congress looked at what had happened, and the investigation that followed produced the fullest public account of how the Zona Rosa case had truly been handled. Not how it was supposed to have been handled, not how the press releases described it, but how it actually worked. In the offices, the cables, the quiet conversations between men who understood that certain things could not be written down. What the record showed was not a cover-up in any dramatic sense. No single order, no smoking cable, no moment where someone chose impunity over accountability and left a clean paper trail of the decision. What it showed was a system in which accountability was negotiated, deferred, diluted, quietly, procedurally, incrementally, with the unhurried patience of institutions that know they will outlast the urgency of any particular scandal. A system in which the question of who might be prosecuted and who might be protected was answered not by law, but by something older and more durable than law. The logic of what the war required, applied over and over until it became indistinguishable from principle. 4 Marines murdered at a restaurant table on a Wednesday night. And in the end, the machinery built to find their killers bent toward the same imperatives that had made the killing possible in the first place. The war needed what it needed. Justice got what was left. Chapter 16. On January 16, 1992, beneath the ornate ceilings of Chapultepec Castle in Mexico City, representatives of the Salvadoran government and the FMLN signed the agreement that formally ended 12 years of civil war. The peace accords, negotiated under United Nations auspices, called for a ceasefire, the demobilization of guerrilla forces, sweeping reforms to the armed forces, the creation of a new civilian police force, land transfer measures, and the establishment of a truth commission to investigate the gravest crimes of the conflict. It was, by any reasonable standard, a historic achievement. El Salvador had endured a war that left roughly 75,000 to 80,000 people dead, uprooted hundreds of thousands more, and distorted nearly every institution in the country. Entire communities had been shattered. The economy had been stunted. Fear had become part of daily life. That the war ended not in total victory for either side, but at a negotiating table was a measure of how exhausted the country had become and of how much diplomatic labor had gone into making a settlement possible. For the FMLN, peace meant transition. Its fighters laid down their arms, and its commanders entered politics. Men who had once operated from safe houses, mountain camps, and clandestine cells now prepared to speak from podiums, run for office, and claim a place in the legal life of the Republic. Former PRTC militants, including almost certainly men who had survived the structures that produced the Mardoqueo Cruz Urban Commando, disappeared into that larger reintegration. The war, at least in its formal military sense, was over. But peace is not the same thing as reckoning. In March 1993, the United Nations Commission on the Truth for El Salvador issued its report, From Madness to Hope. It was one of the most consequential documents ever produced about the war. The commission examined atrocities committed by both the state and the insurgency, and it did so with a bluntness that unsettled the country. It named names. It described massacres, death squad killings, torture, disappearances, and executions with a level of precision that previous reports had often avoided. For many Salvadorans, the report was a necessary act of truth-telling. For many in the military and political establishment, it was an intolerable humiliation. The Zona Rosa massacre appeared in the report, but only briefly. It was treated not as a case study in itself, but as one example within the Commission's broader account of FMLN abuses. The Commission observed that the killing of the Marines reflected a larger guerrilla practice of defining certain categories of people as legitimate targets because of their real or perceived association with the enemy. In one of the report's most striking phrases, it noted that defenseless pleasure seekers became military targets, as in the case of the United States Marines in Zona Rosa. The moral point was sound. The passage captured something essential about the crime. The men at those tables had not been in combat, had not been attacking anyone, had not even been on duty. They had gone out into the city for an evening meal and were transformed in the logic of Revolutionary War into acceptable targets because of what they represented. Yet for the families of the dead, and for the American investigators and prosecutors who had spent years trying to assemble a case, the treatment must have felt painfully thin. The Commission was writing the history of an entire war. Zona Rosa, to it, was one episode among many. To the people who had buried husbands, sons, brothers, and friends, it was not one episode. It was the wound. Then came the second blow. Only 5 days after the Truth Commission released its report, the Salvadoran Legislative Assembly passed a sweeping general amnesty law covering crimes committed during the conflict by both sides. The law was immediately controversial. Critics argued that it violated both constitutional principles and basic standards of justice. Supporters defended it as necessary to preserve the fragile peace. Whatever its legal theory, its practical consequence was unmistakable. It closed off, for the foreseeable future, the possibility of prosecuting most wartime crimes in Salvadoran courts. For the Zona Rosa case, the effect was devastating. Years earlier, in 1987, the Salvadoran government had attempted to use amnesty to shield the defendants, only to reverse course under pressure from the United States. Now, in 1993, a broader and more politically protected amnesty accomplished much the same end. The difference was that the circumstances had changed. The war was over. The peace process had become the overriding priority. Washington no longer had the same leverage, and even if it had tried to apply it, the appetite for reopening old battles in the name of one unresolved case was far weaker than it had been in the middle of the conflict. The formal Salvadoran prosecution of Rivas and Dimas effectively died there. That fact carried a bleak finality. No Salvadoran court would convict anyone for the murder of the 4 Marines killed on June 19, 1985, or for the deaths of the other victims who had been caught in the same hail of gunfire. After years of confessions, intelligence reports, diplomatic pressure, court hearings, delays, evasions, and false starts, the domestic system that had once promised justice simply stepped aside and declared the matter closed. And yet the case was not entirely dead. Under American law, the possibility of prosecution remained alive, at least in theory. The passage of time had not erased the crime, and it had not fully erased the determination of those who believed the murders should still be answered in court. The file remained open, dormant but unresolved, waiting for some event, some break, some renewed burst of public attention strong enough to drag it back into view. That moment would come in May 1995, when a television broadcast unexpectedly revived the story and forced the Zona Rosa massacre, after years of partial forgetting, back into the public eye. Chapter 17. Winnie the Pooh hung from the ceiling next to Spider-Man. Bill Clinton dangled nearby with his papier-mâché grin, fat and patient, waiting to get beaten open at some kid's birthday party. Romeo Gilberto Osorio barely noticed them anymore. When you spend enough years making piñatas, presidents and cartoon bears start to look about the same. He was at his work table, twisting wire into the skeleton of the next one. If you'd wandered in off the street, you'd have thought, retired art teacher, community center guy, someone who remembered everyone's kids' names. You would not have thought, former guerrilla commander, a man who spent 12 years living underground in a country eating itself alive. The man Ed Bradley put on national television and implied in front of 60 million Americans had helped murder 4 United States Marines. Osorio set down the wire and looked at the skeleton on the table. Born in San Francisco in 1947, shipped to El Salvador at 6 months when his parents' marriage fell apart, raised in Ilobasco watching ceramicists work clay with their hands. He came back to the United States at 18 and walked straight into the Vietnam-era draft, joined the Air Force before they could call him, learned English during basic training, rose in rank because he was good at figuring things out. Came back to the mission in the early 70s, helped found the Mission Cultural Center for Latin American Arts, wrote some of the first essays in English on contemporary Salvadoran poetry. Built something real, the slow, patient way. Then he went back to El Salvador to open a fine art gallery, and the timing was about as bad as timing gets. The government shut it down within a year. His friends started disappearing, not metaphorically, not drifting away, but the specific kind of disappearing that happened in El Salvador in 1980, when bodies turned up on roadsides with marks on them that told you everything about the last few hours, and nothing you wanted to know. So he joined the FMLN, lived underground for 12 years. Rose to command. When the war ended in 1992, he came home, made art, opened the piñata shop when the previous owner closed it because the shop paid the rent and kept the studio running. The Air Force and the guerrillas and the 12 Years Underground and the 60 Minutes segment and the federal investigation and the quiet clearance that came too late to undo what the broadcast had already done, all of it lived inside one ordinary-looking man at a work table in the Mission District, while Winnie the Pooh and Spider-Man swayed overhead and the city moved through its afternoon outside the open door. Some stories don't resolve cleanly. They just keep going. The 60 Minutes episode wasn't even about Zona Rosa. What CBS was chasing in May 1995 was a fight over combat awards, specifically whether American military advisors who served in El Salvador deserved the medals that came with having officially been in combat. These were soldiers who had taken fire, returned fire, watched friends get hit, done everything soldiers do in a shooting war, but Washington had called them advisors the entire time, a word chosen to keep the official position clean and the public uninformed. When they came home, that word followed them. No combat awards. No acknowledgement that what they'd been through was real. The Pentagon's paperwork said they'd been training people. The men said they'd been fighting. CBS brought in Osorio, a former FMLN commander, a U.S. citizen living openly in San Francisco, to confirm it from the other side of the gun. And from where he sat, it was simply the truth. The rebels had treated American advisors as military targets. Those men had been in a war. That was the interview he thought he was giving. Then Bradley asked about the FMLN's broader strategy of targeting American servicemen, and Osorio answered honestly, yes, it had been deliberate. It had been policy. The idea was to pressure Congress into cutting support for the Salvadoran military. This wasn't a confession. It was documented strategy, part of the public record of a war that had been over for 3 years. Bradley ran the segment anyway, with narration telling viewers that Osorio had admitted to helping plan the Zona Rosa massacre. Words Osorio had not spoken, had not implied. That had no real relationship to anything he'd said on camera. A week later, he denied it in the San Francisco Examiner. By then, 60 million people had already seen it, and tucked it away in the place where the mind files things it assumes are true. What followed was something the federal government almost never does. It investigated itself. The Senate Intelligence Committee ordered a full review. Inspector General offices at Justice, the CIA, State, and the Pentagon all got pulled in. Thousands of classified documents came out of the archives where they'd been sitting for a decade. Dozens of officials were interviewed under oath. The DOJ prosecutors who had spent years working the Zona Rosa case told the review something that landed hard. They had never heard the name Gilberto Osorio before the broadcast. Not once. A decade of building the case and the name had never crossed their desks. After the segment aired, a DOJ attorney named Dana Beal ran it all the way down and found nothing. No witness, no document, no intercept, no thread of any kind placing Osorio in the planning or execution of June 19, 1985. He'd been FMLN, had risen to command, knew the organization's thinking from the inside. But there was nothing tying him to Zona Rosa. Bradley had implied more than the evidence could support, and the gap between those two things, between what television can suggest and what a courtroom can prove, was the space Osorio had been living in since the cameras went dark. What the review actually turned up had nothing to do with Osorio. The CIA had known for years who probably ran the operation. His name was Pedro Antonio Andrade. The agency's internal assessment naming him as the likely mastermind had been withheld from the DOJ prosecutors building the case, not for days, but for months, while the investigation moved forward without its most important piece of intelligence. When Andrade was finally arrested in El Salvador in 1989, the U.S. Embassy sent a formal request that he not be prosecuted. He was worth more as an active intelligence asset than as a defendant in a murder case. That had been rumored for years, passed around in careful language between people unsure how much they were allowed to say. The review made it something else. Documented, quoted, sitting in the official record with the permanence of things that were never meant to see daylight. In June 1990, about a year after his arrest, Pedro Antonio Andrade boarded a flight to the United States. The man intelligence reports had repeatedly linked to Zona Rosa, the man some investigators believed had helped plan the murder of 4 American Marines, was being allowed to enter the very country those Marines had sworn to defend. No courtroom ruling, no public debate. The decision moved instead through the machinery of government, a State Department parole request to the Immigration and Naturalization Service, arguing that Andrade had provided valuable assistance and that his life was in danger. INS approved it under a provision allowing entry in the public interest. Each agency signed off on its own piece and trusted that someone else was minding the whole. While in Salvadoran custody, Andrade had spent months identifying guerrilla personnel, discussing weapons caches, helping American officials map the insurgency from the inside. According to government records, he was even helping produce a CIA-funded propaganda film denouncing the FMLN. To some officials, he was a rare asset whose information could save lives. Assistant U.S. Attorney John Murtaugh learned about it after the fact. He was shocked. He was furious. He believed significant intelligence pointed to Andrade's involvement in the massacre, even if prosecutors lacked enough admissible evidence to bring charges. But the decision had already been made. Andrade was in America, living among relatives, beyond the reach of the objections that had never been heard. Years later, a Justice Department Inspector General investigation concluded that the parole process had broken down. Officials from multiple agencies had previously agreed that any proposal to bring Andrade to the United States required interagency review. That review never occurred. The request moved through routine channels. DOJ's opposition was never formally presented to the officials who approved it. The Inspector General ultimately concluded that DOJ's objections had been reasonable, that the intelligence linking Andrade to the attack was real. The result was the most extraordinary irony of the entire case. The United States had spent years hunting the men who killed 4 Marines. One of the individuals suspected of helping orchestrate the attack was ultimately granted entry into the United States, not despite his connection to the war, but because of it. Intelligence had outweighed prosecution. And while the families of the dead kept searching for answers, Andrade began a new life in America. Meanwhile, Osorio, cleared of any involvement, had his face shown to 60 million Americans as a probable killer. That raised a question nobody particularly wanted to answer out loud. Had others connected to Zona Rosa been let in? Had the border been open in some fashion to people with blood on their hands from a restaurant terrace in San Salvador? The answer was neither clean nor comforting. Some Salvadorans with ties, direct or indirect, to the guerrilla networks involved had entered the country over the years, coming through a mix of immigration channels, intelligence arrangements, and the ordinary gaps that open up when agencies don't talk to each other and nobody is assigned to mind the space between them. There was no evidence of a deliberate policy. Nobody sat in a room and signed off on that. But there was also nothing that reliably stopped it. No system, no cross-check, no process that functioned across agency lines. It wasn't a conspiracy. It was something more mundane and in some ways more disturbing than a conspiracy. A bureaucracy doing what bureaucracies do, each part optimizing for its own mission, leaving the accounting to someone else, and hoping the pieces added up to something that looked like justice from far enough away. In 1997, 12 years after the attack, the Senate held public hearings. Officials testified. Documents went into the record. For the families of the 4 Marines, it wasn't closure. It was a reminder of everything that hadn't happened. A detailed, documented, carefully qualified account of why the thing that was promised on the tarmac at Andrews Air Force Base had not been delivered. No one was convicted in an American court. Sealed charges stayed sealed. Others were released or lost in the machinery of a foreign legal system, pushed beyond the reach of prosecution by the slow accumulation of war, diplomacy, and time. By the late 1990s, The urgency that had once made every decision feel necessary had long since dissolved. What was left was the record, not one moment where someone chose impunity over accountability, but a long sequence of individual decisions, each defensible on its own terms, each reasonable given the pressures of the moment, that taken together had produced a result nobody would have publicly defended at the start. The system built to find them had been pulled in two directions at every critical point and had consistently resolved that tension the same way. It didn't fail completely. It didn't succeed either. It did what institutions do when the crisis fades and the political cost of accountability starts to outweigh the political cost of letting things drift. It found a way to keep moving forward while leaving certain things permanently behind. Chapter 18. The war ended on paper in January 1992, but El Salvador did not become a different country overnight. Peace came the way exhaustion comes, not as a triumph, but as a threshold, the point past which continuing was simply no longer possible. The accords were real. The ceasefire held. The FMLN fighters came down from the mountains and out of the safe houses and laid their weapons in stacks that were photographed and catalogued and handed over to UN observers who had flown in from places that had never known this particular kind of war. It was an extraordinary thing, objectively, a guerrilla movement that had fought the state for 12 years, agreeing to become part of it, to trade the logic of the gun for the slower, more uncertain logic of the ballot box. But the institutions those ballots were meant to animate were not ready for what was being asked of them. The economy was fragile. The judiciary was weak. The security forces that the accords were supposed to transform carried inside them the habits of a system that had spent a decade operating outside the law. Disappearances, death squads, the casual violence of men who had been told, repeatedly and at the highest levels, that certain things were permitted. You could sign those men into a new institutional framework. You could not sign out what they had become. The gap between the country, the accords imagined, and the country that actually existed on the first morning of peace was vast, and it did not close quickly. Governing proved harder than opposing. It always does. The FMLN discovered this with the grinding specificity of a party that had built its identity around resistance and now had to build a budget. Corruption moved into the spaces that ideology had occupied. Bureaucracy absorbed momentum. The promises made at Chapultepec, land reform, institutional accountability, the possibility of a security that did not depend on fear, collided with the reality of a state that lacked the capacity and sometimes the will to deliver them. Public expectations were high. Results were uneven. The distance between what had been promised and what arrived widened with each election cycle, until, for many Salvadorans, it had stopped feeling like a gap and started feeling like the truth about how things worked. Meanwhile, another story was unfolding. Quieter at first, less visible, but in the long run more consequential than the political drama playing out in San Salvador. Migration had accelerated during the war, people fleeing violence the way water moves away from pressure, toward wherever the opening was. Los Angeles, Washington, Houston, New York, cities that had not asked for an influx of Spanish-speaking refugees from a conflict most Americans could not have located on a map, and that received one anyway, in the tens and then hundreds of thousands, people arriving with almost nothing and building out of necessity, out of stubbornness, out of the particular human insistence on survival, something resembling a life. They worked construction and restaurants and maintenance. They rented rooms in neighborhoods that were not yet neighborhoods, that became neighborhoods because enough of them arrived and stayed. They sent money home. Remittances that became, over time, not a supplement to the Salvadoran economy, but its architecture, the thing holding the whole structure upright. El Salvador was no longer simply a place these people had left. It was something they carried forward, maintained across the distance of a continent, kept alive in the wiring of their phones and the envelopes sent south every month. But stability abroad did not mean security. Many lived without legal status, in crowded housing, navigating systems that offered real opportunity alongside the constant low-grade anxiety of a life that could be dismantled by a single encounter with the wrong official at the wrong moment. The opportunity was genuine. So was the precariousness. And a second generation was coming of age. In Los Angeles, Salvadoran youth entered a city that already had its own geography of violence. Neighborhoods where gang structures had been entrenched for decades, where the available forms of belonging were limited, where schools were under-resourced and families were focused on survival in the most literal sense. Institutional support was scarce. The formal systems that were supposed to catch young people in the gaps, counselors, after-school programs, the ordinary social infrastructure of stability, were not built for this volume, this need, this particular combination of displacement and poverty, and the cultural dislocation of being raised between two worlds without fully belonging to either. For some, belonging was found elsewhere, MS-13 did not emerge from the Salvadoran Civil War. It was formed in the United States, in American cities, shaped by American conditions, the specific pressures of immigrant poverty, the specific violence of neighborhoods where control was already organized along gang lines, the specific logic of a young person who needs protection and finds it in the only place offering any. The connection to El Salvador was not ideological, it was demographic. The same communities, the same diaspora, the same generation, caught between the country their parents had fled and the country that had not quite accepted them. Over time, the organizations became more structured, more disciplined, more capable of violence at a scale that began to attract a different kind of attention. Then the dynamics were sent back. As American deportation policy hardened through the 1990s and into the 2000s, thousands were returned to El Salvador, many of whom had spent most of their lives in the United States, who spoke English more fluently than Spanish, who had no meaningful connection to the country their paperwork said they were from. They arrived in a nation still struggling to rebuild its basic institutions, carrying structures that had developed on foreign soil, in a foreign context, and that now took root in ground that had very little holding it together. El Salvador was not prepared. It did not have the prisons, the social services, the law enforcement capacity, or the political coherence to absorb what was arriving. What followed was not a sudden collapse. It rarely is. It was a gradual expansion, neighborhood by neighborhood, of an influence that the state could not match and increasingly could not contain. Violence took on a different character than the war had produced. Less ideological. No manifestos, no political demands, no vision of a future society against which the present could be measured and found wanting. What replaced all of that was simpler, and in some ways, more suffocating. Control. Street by street, block by block. The invisible internal borders of a country that had traded one form of terror for another. Businesses paid extortion or closed. Families learned which corners were crossable and which were not. Absorbed this knowledge into the body the way people absorb any information essential to daily survival. Automatically, without having to think about it consciously, the way you learn to read the weather. Young men received a recruitment visit and understood that the answer they gave would determine what came next. Women learned routes home that avoided certain stretches of road. Governments responded with force because force was the language available to them. Mass arrests, emergency measures, crackdowns announced with the confident rhetoric of states that have confused activity with progress. Prisons filled. The organizations adapted, found in confinement not dissolution, but a new kind of structure. The cell block as headquarters, the prison yard as command center, the state's own infrastructure turned into the architecture of the thing the state was trying to destroy. Public frustration deepened into something that no longer had patience for the language of improvement. By the late 2010s, the question had shifted. It was no longer whether the post-war system could be made to work better. That question assumed a system capable of working, one that needed adjustment rather than replacement. What the accumulated years had produced instead, the failed promises, the widening impunity, The violence that the state seemed unable to arrest and in some places seemed simply to have accommodated was a population that had stopped believing in the premise of the question. For many Salvadorans, the post-war order had failed its most basic obligation: not prosperity, not equality, not the distant aspirations of the peace accords, but the simpler and more foundational thing underneath all of those: security. The ordinary expectation that a person could move through their day without calculating the odds of not coming home. When a system is seen as incapable, not merely imperfect, not frustrating, but genuinely, structurally unable to deliver the thing it exists to deliver, the demand stops being for reform. It becomes a demand for something different entirely. What that something would look like and what it would cost was the question El Salvador was about to answer. Chapter 19. By the late 2010s, El Salvador no longer felt like a country recovering from war. It felt like a country that had never quite escaped one. The peace accords had ended the fighting 3 decades earlier, but they had not restored what the fighting destroyed: trust in institutions. The basic expectation that the state would show up, that the law applied, that the distance between what the government promised and what ordinary people actually experienced was not so vast as to be insulting. Governments came and went: ARENA, the FMLN, the whole rotation of the post-war political order, promising reform, security, investment, the gradual improvement of a country that had already endured so much. And daily life in many neighborhoods continued under a different kind of control than any of them had managed to dislodge. The violence had changed its character. It no longer arrived as spectacular acts of war: the ambush, the massacre, the pitched battle for a hilltop that would appear in a UN report. It had settled into routines so ordinary they were almost invisible to anyone not living inside them. Bus drivers paid extortion before sunrise, the money handed over in the quiet before passengers arrived, a transaction so regular it had become part of the operating cost of the route. Shop owners kept separate cash hidden for gang collections, not emergency funds, but line items, as predictable as rent. Taxi drivers refused certain districts after dark because crossing the wrong street could mean never coming home. And this was not paranoia, but a reasonable reading of available evidence. Children grew up knowing which colors not to wear. Mothers lowered their voices when discussing gangs, even inside their own houses, a habit so deeply internalized it no longer required conscious thought. Young men learned that looking nervous near police could get them detained, and looking unfamiliar in gang territory could get them killed, and that navigating between those two dangers was simply the permanent condition of being young and male in the wrong zip code. The fear became so thoroughly woven into the texture of daily life that many Salvadorans had stopped imagining the country could function differently. Not cynicism exactly, something more complete than cynicism: the absorbed knowledge of a population that had been trying to tell its government something for years and had concluded, with the quiet finality of the repeatedly unheard, that the government was not listening. That exhaustion created the opening for Nayib Bukele. Bukele understood something that the older political parties had stopped being able to see, perhaps because they had been inside the system long enough to have confused it with reality. Salvadorans did not want another security strategy. They did not want another commission, another promise, another administration that would announce its commitment to the problem in language that had already been used by the previous administration. After years of extortion and disappearances and homicide rates that made the country one of the most dangerous on earth, people wanted something simpler and more fundamental. They wanted the fear to stop. He was not a conventional figure in Salvadoran politics, which was itself part of the appeal. He had been mayor of Nuevo Cuscatlan and then of San Salvador, and he had cultivated, through those years, a public persona that was calibrated carefully for a population that had lost its appetite for the conventions of the post-war political order. The formal suits, the careful language, the implicit promise that the system was basically sound and needed only the right people at its controls. Bukele wore different clothes. He spoke differently. He used social media with the instinctive fluency of someone who understood that the platforms had changed what political communication could be, that a president could now address his country directly and continuously, and without the mediation of institutions he found inconvenient. He treated the entire political order that had emerged from the Civil War as something broken beyond repair. The old parties sounded tired because they were tired, their promises recycled through so many iterations that the language had worn smooth, had lost whatever edge it once carried. Every administration had announced a new security strategy. Homicide rates had climbed. Gang influence had expanded deeper into daily life. The gap between what was promised and what existed had become, for many Salvadorans, not a political problem, but a settled fact about how the world worked. He was elected in 2019, with 53% of the vote on the first ballot, a margin that said something about the size of the frustration he was running against. Then came March 2022, and the weekend that changed everything. Over the course of 3 days, dozens of people were murdered across El Salvador in one of the deadliest surges of gang violence the country had seen in years. Bodies appeared across the capital and surrounding departments. Panic moved through neighborhoods that had spent years balancing themselves uneasily between gangs and the state, the equilibrium that passed for normalcy in a country where normalcy had long been negotiated at gunpoint. Bukele responded with overwhelming force. The government declared a state of exception. Constitutional protections were suspended. Police and military authority expanded dramatically, almost overnight. Security forces flooded into communities across the country, while arrests accelerated at a pace that the legal system was not built to process and made no particular effort to slow. Within weeks, tens of thousands had been detained. Within months, the number would reach 60,000, then more. Young men swept up by an operation that moved faster than any mechanism of oversight could follow. 5. The government's position, stated or implied, was that this was the price of the emergency, and that the emergency justified the price. For many Salvadorans watching from outside the prison walls, the most immediate reality was impossible to argue with. The streets were getting quieter. Bus drivers moved through routes without stopping to pay. Small businesses stayed open later. Parks and plazas that had emptied before sunset began filling again. Families, children, the ordinary human use of public space that had been impossible in many neighborhoods for so long that its return felt almost surreal. In parts of San Salvador, people walked at night with a comfort they had not felt in decades, and this was not a small thing. It was not an abstraction. It was the physical experience of a country that had changed, and it registered in the body in a way that arguments about procedural justice could not easily reach. The government understood the power of the image. Photographs were released showing rows of detainees, shaved heads, tattooed torsos, seated shoulder to shoulder under floodlights inside massive prison compounds, and the images circulated with a speed and reach that the government did not discourage. CECOT, the Terrorism Confinement Center, became the visual vocabulary of the new El Salvador. Enormous concrete walls, razor wire surveillance towers, the architecture of absolute control photographed from angles that emphasized its scale. The message was legible to anyone who saw it. The government was not negotiating. It was not managing or containing or seeking accommodation. It intended to dominate completely, and it wanted that intention to be visible. For the gangs, which had built their power partly on the projection of inevitability, the idea that they were permanent, that the state would never fully commit to the confrontation, that some equilibrium would always be reachable, the psychological blow was as significant as the operational one. The illusion collapsed, but the transformation carried consequences that were harder to photograph. The same emergency powers that weakened the gangs weakened the institutional restraints on state authority that had taken years to build and would take years to rebuild, if they were rebuilt at all. Due process had not simply been suspended. It had been seen to be suspendable, and governments rarely forget what they have learned they can do. Detainees died in custody. Reports of overcrowding, limited legal access, and wrongful imprisonment accumulated in human rights documentation that the government disputed and supporters of the crackdown largely set aside on the reasonable but uncomfortable grounds that the system being protected had already failed to protect anyone. Critics made the argument about democratic safeguards. They were not wrong, exactly. The warning that exceptional measures, once normalized, tend to become the new normal, that populations accustomed to security delivered through the suspension of rights find it difficult to reclaim those rights without accepting the insecurity that came with them, was historically grounded, carefully made, and carried the weight of what similar experiments in similar countries had produced. But it landed differently in a neighborhood where children had spent their entire lives not wearing certain colors. Abstract concerns about institutional design carried different emotional weight than finally being able to walk to the corner at night. This is not a failure of political understanding. It is the entirely rational response of people who have been told, for years, that the system was working to protect them, and who have the specific lived experience of what that protection actually felt like. When the choice is presented as liberty with fear or safety without liberty, people who have known real fear for a long time will not always choose the way that editorial boards recommend. El Salvador today does not resemble the country of the 1980s, or even the country of a decade ago. The streets of San Salvador are calmer than they have been in generations. The state projects and authority it had lost so gradually that many Salvadorans had stopped expecting to see it returned. Neighborhoods once considered untouchable have been pulled back under government control, not without cost, not without the dark arithmetic of what was spent to achieve it, but pulled back. Whether the transformation holds, whether it becomes the foundation of something genuinely new, or whether it is another chapter in the country's long education in the gap between what power promises and what it delivers, is the question that hangs, still unanswered, over everything. The final outcome remains unwritten. What is written, in the faces of the people who walk through quiet streets that were not quiet before, is something that policy analysis tends to struggle with, and that El Salvador has earned the right to feel. The specific embodied relief of a fear that has, at least for now, gone somewhere else. What replaced it, and what that replacement will cost, is the part the country is still living through. Chapter 20. The heat outside Quantico on June 19, 2018, wasn't a number on a thermometer. It was a weight, thick and familiar. Anton Kossuth stepped onto the base with his hands pushed deep into his pockets, anchoring the small tremor that had been his shadow since 1985. Beside him, the National Museum of the Marine Corps cut into the skyline, 200 feet of steel and glass set at the exact angle of the flag raisers at Iwo Jima. Inside, the galleries hummed. Screens flashed, exhibits pulsed, archival combat audio rolled through the floor, all of it celebrating a century of triumph. Anton walked the polished cases without seeing them. His eyes were turned inward, fixed on a single frame of time he had never been able to stop. They moved past the museum toward the training compound. The low, gritty program he had known was gone, replaced by the administrative monolith of the Marine Corps Embassy Security Group. Today, the command runs detachments to 168 posts across 18 time zones, under a structure where its Marines answer first to the Secretary of State. Anton watched a group of them gear up. Blast walls, reinforced concrete, self-contained quarters on embassy ground. A sterile world, nothing like his own, when the detachment had rented houses out in the neighborhood and run its own wide-open bar. Inside the headquarters foyer, the scale of all of it fell away. The silence was complete. No crowd, no cameras, no fanfare. Just a corridor of flags around a black marble wall of honor, and on metal easels before the stone, 4 wreaths. Each framed a photograph. Each framed a face he knew better than his own. Around him stood Carolyn and Constance, Greg Weber's sisters, Gunnery Sergeant William Farnell, the assistant NCOIC who had stood beside the Marines during the tragic events in San Salvador, and Vincent Downs of the Marine Embassy Guard Association, whose dedication has helped preserve the memory of the fallen and ensure their sacrifice is never forgotten. Then Vincent Downs, a former Marine Staff Sergeant and now a deputy sheriff in Arlington County, stepped forward, his shoes clicking softly across the floor. He placed a heavy wooden brass plaque into Anton's hands and began to read the citation engraved upon it. For his courage under fire, his complete disregard for his own safety, and for moving 40 to 60 people to safety inside a nearby restaurant, actions that undoubtedly saved many lives. The brass caught the light of the room, but Anton's mind drifted backward into the darkness. One question remained, the one no metal could answer. Why was he the one standing here to receive it? The tape began to rewind. The spools clicked into place, the way they always did, and ran the same sequence they always ran. June 19, 1985. San Salvador. The air thick, smelling of rain and exhaust. The only reason the boys had left the compound that night was the liver and onions. The embassy cook had made it for dinner, a meal the detachment hated enough to drive them out the door after burgers and a few cold beers. When they pulled up to the café in the Zona Rosa, Anton didn't make a tactical decision. He saw a girl at Rob Hindle's table and walked over, a young Marine chasing a conversation. Then Rob's voice, easy over the noise of the patio. "Sit down, guys. I'll buy you a beer." That sentence, and the half-glass that followed, was the only thing between Anton and a body bag. If he hadn't crossed the patio to chase a smile, he would have been at the first table when the truck pulled up. He would be a name cut into the black marble instead of a man standing in front of it. When the automatic fire tore open the night, the infantryman took over. He had nearly washed out of Marine Security Guard School, bottom 10%, a staff that thought he wasn't polished enough for diplomatic work. None of that mattered now. He scrounged loose rounds, ignored the gunfire chewing the walls, and dragged 40 to 60 people into the next-door restaurant, then hauled the heavy doors shut behind them. Farnell told him later it had blown his mind. Anton had proved the old truth. You don't judge a book by its cover. But survival had a price, and it was lying on the pavement. The shooters had stood over his friends and reloaded 2-3 times to finish the work. He never thought of them by rank. He thought of who they had been before the smoke. Greg Weber, the achiever out of Cincinnati. Cross-country runner, National Honor Society, a big brother to kids who needed one. He had pushed to graduate first in their MSG class for one reason. So he could volunteer for El Salvador, because he believed that was where he was needed most. Patrick Kwiatkowski, from Wausau, Wisconsin. An amateur boxer who had been an altar boy, who loved the ski slopes and a line in the water. He had joined to test himself and meant to use the GI Bill for college. He was killed one day short of his 21st birthday. Tom Handwork from Boardman, outside Youngstown, Ohio. A quiet kid who loved books enough to skip class and hide in the library reading about the Marines. He wanted to write an old Hollywood picture, Errol Flynn style, for the president to star in. Sure, the office held some sacred bond with the troops. Bobby Joe Dixon from Tuscaloosa, Alabama. A pitcher, an Alabama football man, a wide and constant smile. He had volunteered for the danger of El Salvador and played Born in the USA every chance he got. 3 months before, on leave, he had finalized his will. Sure, he wasn't coming home. The ceremony receded as the years went on. It had been 41 years since the guns spoke in San Salvador, and Anton's life had long since settled into a quiet rhythm, a long way from Quantico. In Reno, he found his place at Truckee Overhead Door. For 13 years, he was the company's can-do man: inventory, recycling, job prep, purchasing, shipping, and receiving, a hand in the office or out with a technician. Whatever was needed, he did it. He worked hard and kept to the quiet corners of the business. The post-traumatic stress didn't show up as a fear of fireworks. It came as static. He would be tracking a high-tension spring in the quiet of the shop when the film started up behind his eyes. Greg's torn shirt, the magazines clicking home, and a wave of old fury would tear loose, and he would shout into the empty space, "God damn it!" The busy, adaptable job let him keep moving, working the splinters loose without having to explain them to people who had never seen a war zone. What the violence left him was a hard, quiet devotion to peace. He didn't hunt. He didn't fish. He wanted no part of it. He had carried his brother's blood too long to ever again be the reason blood came out of a living thing. Holding the plaque on his desk, he understood at last what his survival had been. Not a thunderbolt from above. A beer. The bitterness still burned underneath. The investigation had collapsed into politics and procedure. The men who planned and carried out the killings were never made to answer. They slipped through the cracks of a larger game. Justice had not been deferred. It had been denied. But he had decided not to be swallowed by the patio in the Zona Rosa. He would be its bridge instead. Standing at the wall with the families, he had passed the torch. He was the keeper of the tape, and he was finally letting the world watch the recording. The embassy security group went on changing, growing safer and more sophisticated every year. And for the men carrying the invisible weight of it, the path was slowly catching up to the pain, taking down the old stigmas one at a time. Pop. A beer tab broke the quiet of the room, the Truckee River running outside like a thin wall against the past. He was a garage door mechanic living alone in Reno, and he was no longer trapped on that bloody patio in San Salvador. He had done what the politicians and the intelligence committees would not. He had brought Greg, Patrick, Tom, and Bobby Joe back into the light. There would be no prison, no courtroom, no verdict. The spools would keep turning. The tape would still play in the dark. But the silence was broken. The truth was out. And for now, that was the only justice left. Epilogue. The restaurants are different now. Glass fronts and modern signs stand where older facades once faced Avenida La Revolucion. Music still spills into the streets of the Zona Rosa after dark, while waiters move between crowded tables carrying drinks into the warm San Salvador night. Young couples laugh beneath patio lights without realizing they are sitting on ground where men once died beneath gunsmoke and shattered glass. There is no large memorial marking the place where the white pickup truck slowed on June 19, 1985. No plaque forces strangers to stop and remember. Most people walking through the Zona Rosa today would never know what happened there unless somebody told them. But memory survived anyway. Each year inside the United States Embassy in San Salvador, Marines still gather quietly to read the names aloud. Thomas Handwerk, Bobby Dixon, Gregory Weber, Patrick Kwiatkowski. The ceremony remains simple because Marines understand something civilians sometimes forget. Remembrance does not need spectacle to matter. Over time, that remembrance spread beyond El Salvador itself. Marine security guards around the world now perform the Zona Rosa Challenge, a brutal memorial workout honoring the 4 Marines killed that night. Young Marines stationed at embassies across Europe, Asia, Africa, and the Middle East sweat through repetitions tied to the ages of men they never met but somehow still know. During those workouts, the stories survive. Greg Weber grinning through impossible pull-ups, Tom Handwerk standing squared away no matter the circumstances, Patrick Kwiatkowski talking about his girlfriend arriving the next day, Bobby Dixon pushing younger Marines harder because standards mattered. And somewhere inside those stories, the dead remain alive for a little while longer. Anton Kossuth carried the memory of that night with him long after the gunfire ended. Decades later, certain details still returned instantly. The screams, the radio chatter, the smoke hanging over the terraces, Greg Weber smiling at the pull-up bars only days before the attack. The survivors grew older. The men killed in the Zona Rosa never did. That may be the cruelest thing about violence. Time keeps moving for everyone except the dead. Today, the Zona Rosa feels alive again. Music fills the streets. Restaurants stay crowded. Young Marines still walk through San Salvador, representing the same corps and standing the same watch as the men who came before them. Most will never hear gunfire there. That is part of the legacy too. Because in the end, the Marines killed that night were not remembered simply for how they died. They are remembered because of how they lived, with discipline, humor, loyalty, and the quiet confidence Marines carry into dangerous places far from home. The city moved on. The Corps did not forget. And as long as their names are still spoken somewhere beneath the lights of San Salvador, the men lost in the Zona Rosa are never entirely gone.